A federal jury just finding both Dean and Adam Skelos guilty on all charges. We are live at the courthouse with reaction from their attorney and more. Then many Republicans are getting more worried that Donald Trump could actually win the nomination, and now they're working on ways to stop him. And as Ted cruises into a lead in Iowa, I'm going to look at why he should scare the establishment Republicans just as much, if not even more, than the Donald. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, the headline is this: guilty on all 8 federal corruption charges. That's what the jury decided a few hours ago in the Dean and Adam Skelos trial. Our senior political reporter, Andrew Whitman, he's live outside the courthouse with the very latest. Andrew?
Well, Rich, as you mentioned, State Senator Dean Skelos, his son Adam Skelos, both found guilty of all 8 counts against them today. The 8 women and 4 men on the jury took a total of less than 8 hours to deliberate, and only a little less than 3 hours today, once they got behind closed doors, to reach that conclusion. And it was announced just after 2 o'clock today. Dean and Adam Skelos guilty of corruption, conspiracy, and wire fraud. The Skeloses, Dean and Adam, were both stoic in the courtroom, displaying little emotion as the verdict was read. The same was not true for Dean's wife, Gail. She burst into tears and was consoled by other relatives. The Skeloses later met the media, Father Dean embracing son Adam, but they remained silent as their attorney made this brief statement.
We are obviously very disappointed with the verdict. The next step is post-trial motions, and we intend to pursue them vigorously. Thank you.
And the Skeloses continued their silence as they were chased by a mob of reporters. They offered no comment and continued to show little, if any, emotion, despite all the questions being asked. U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara was in the courtroom as the verdicts were read this afternoon. He issued no comment, but later his office released this statement that read in part, quote, "How many prosecutions will it take before Albany gives the people of New York the honest government they deserve?" Members of the jury also declined to speak formally to the press after the conclusion of the trial today, though according to a radio report, the jury's forewoman was quoted as saying there was very little dissension among the panel throughout the entire deliberative process. They only met today to go over a few last details that they wanted to iron through. So the Skeloses right now are planning an appeal. They will be back in court on March 3rd. If given the maximum sentence for each of these penalties, they could face up to 130 years in prison, although it's much more likely they'll be looking at 20-year prison sentences instead. And one final detail from here in Lower Manhattan, and that has to do with Dean Skelos' tenure in the state Senate. He had been the majority leader and resigned that position, but he retained his seat representing Nassau County in the state Senate. Under state law, he's going to have to give up that as well. He will likely have to resign that seat as early as Monday or Tuesday. That is the very latest here from outside the Pat Moynihan, we'll call it a courtroom here in Lower Manhattan. Andrew Whitman, FiOS 1 News. Rich, let's send it back to you in the studio.
You know, it's karma. All are joking around Dominic. It came back to bite you there. You know, Andrew, yesterday when the jury was sent home, they had requested a ton of information, including all the wiretaps and also some of the testimony. The belief was, given how voluminous that was, we weren't going to get a verdict today, but yet we got one earlier this afternoon. Was there any explanation for why they wanted to see so many readbacks?
Well, again, they just wanted to hear some of the details, and I guess there might have been a lingering question or two. I'm extrapolating because, again, members of the jury didn't really talk to the press after the verdict was announced. Now, we know the content, and we heard those wiretaps being played in court. Many of them had to deal with Ed Mangano, the Republican Nassau County executive who did a lot of business with the Skeloses. And in fact, one of the wiretaps itself was a conversation between Dean Skelos and Ed Mangano, and they seemed to be talking in a certain level of code about things that they had irons in the fire. Take a listen to one of the excerpts from that wiretap.
Where does that leave, the other situation?
The privatization of the sewer?
Yeah.
Independent.
No, but where does it leave that other situation that's been out there for a couple of years?
It just leaves the funding, which doesn't come from them. It doesn't come from that. So the funding is supposed to come from either FEMA or...
No, I understand that, but I don't understand this.
Now, interestingly, after that tape and others were played in court, the Skelos defense team actually made a motion to essentially have the case dismissed or have them acquitted simply by the judge's ruling this afternoon. Obviously, the judge felt disinclined to do that, said the case could continue, and it wasn't more than a couple of hours later that the jury came back with guilty counts for all 8 counts for both Skeloses. Rich?
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. And I want to bring in our panel to discuss this. Scott Vanderhoff's an attorney and 5-time Rockland County executive, and Richard St. Paul, also an attorney, Republican strategist, and former vice chair for the National Black Republican Association. Okay, you know, in many ways, Scott, it's been said that this trial and the Silver trial before it was basically a case against Albany, and that Albany was on trial in many ways. The 2 of the 3 men in the room, if you will, the Assembly Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader, they've now been found guilty and not guilty on some marginal stuff, guilty on some serious charges, and on all counts presented before them. What is the postscript for Albany going ahead? Forget the reforms for a minute. Does it confirm all the worst suspicions of the public that were merited? Or did we just find 2 bad apples who happen to be in a position of power for too long with too much access to too many levers?
I think it confirms probably the worst fears that people have. I mean, it's not just them. It's Tom Libous, too, who was the 3rd person in the Senate, or the 2nd behind Dean Skelos. So it really it feeds to this need, or this thought that Albany is corrupt from the top down. And of course, these 2 guys, the 2 leaders, you know, being the most important. And what's interesting, Richard, is that all of it was circumstantial, pretty much. I mean, there was no okay, I will do this for you if you do that. It was all kind of, you know, well, I'll talk to him. I mean, as damning as the tapes were, you never heard Dean Skelos say, okay, I'm going to prove this one thing. I want to add one other point, though. Remember the 18-minute gap on the tapes? Mm-hmm. How did the county of Nassau get these bids and do this enormous work? This whole thing is still a mystery.
I think Mr. Mangano's got a whole bunch of questions coming his way. You know, Richard, if anything, if we ever try and find stuff for bipartisan agreement here, we have Democrats and Republicans in trouble. This is not a single party issue. It's not a single chamber issue. We've had so many convictions, so many charges, so much scandal. To me, that stay tuned line from Bahara, he just, by the way, first said that famously before, stay tuned as to more, but also he just opened up a Twitter account, and he said earlier this week, and he said his famous lines, you know, stay tuned. This thing has the chance to metastasize even further. Right. The top 2 guys are down. Explain to folks, as an attorney here, when we get to the sentencing phase, if they have any chips to play, you know, anybody to flip on or whatever else, assuming there's a willing prosecutor here, we could get more dirt. And God knows, you think Shelley Silver, after 40 years in the Assembly, knows where a few bodies are buried.
I agree, and I'm surprised that there wasn't any, you know, cooperation agreements for Skelos.
Apparently, we heard, without confirmation, there was one offered to Silver. We don't know the terms of that. He and his counsel turned it down. There was one requested by Skelos, but it wasn't accepted on the part of the prosecution. But now that we know they're looking at it in all likelihood, you know the sentencing guidelines, probably 20 years a pop here for all 3 of the characters.
That's right. Usually the sentencing guidelines, and again, there are sentencing guidelines. The judge does not have to follow them. But yeah, the maximum sentence ever heard can be over 100 years. You typically don't see that. But yes, if there's a card to play, there should be a card to play, and there's only, to me, seems like only one person to go after next between the majority leader.
Well, there's 2 different kinds, as you know. There's vertical, which is you're going to go north, and there's only one guy above both leaderships, or you could go more horizontal and find more players in the center of the Assembly here to give credence that it is a swamp, needs dredging. Now, that brings me, Scott, to the broader point. Now, I remember we've talked about this week, in fact. Governor Cuomo famously, when he was elected, his inauguration in his first term, forget about even re-election, he chose a backdrop of Tammany Hall, said he was going to drain the swamp, how he was going to clean up corruption, bring transparency and everything else. In fact, he brought the Moreland Commission, and we all now know, and I think our audience does, famously shut it down, and that was the impetus in large part for where Preet Bharara went after and what he found. However, this is the part that surprised me, and I've had state lawmakers at the table, including a reformer from York County, Mr. Carlucci here for the state Senate, saying he's got a bunch of proposals that he wants to do. He doesn't think the governor's going far enough. But when pressed on a full-time legislature and also when pressed on more reforms here, campaign finance including among them, I want to remind the folks what Governor Cuomo said. Now, this was after the Silver conviction here. He said, if a person's going to break the law, the person's going to break the law. Talking about more, reform. And then he also went on to say there's no appetite to do it in the legislature. Now, folks have said to me, Scott, that he's not going to bring an issue here if he's not going to be able to get the thing passed. But I'm sorry. Show me a lawmaker who wants to vote no on the record, right, or won't even let it come up for a vote here to have more reform, whether it's full-time legislature, whether it's full disclosure on outside income, whether it's whatever it is, losing pensions if you're convicted and all the rest. He can get anything he wants through. It's a cop-out for the governor to say that Albany won't play ball. Am I wrong?
No, you're not. He's very weak-kneed, to use that old expression, in this entire thing. And he's made such serious mistakes. I mean, the Moreland Commission disbanding that, okay? And his comments really have been very weak, in my view, even in responding to these. I'm sure he's not even had a statement yet with respect to Dean Skelos. He takes hours to try to figure out what to say. Yeah. It's as if he doesn't know how to move. And you're right, Richard. Why wouldn't you go now and try something dramatic, just to get people talking about it, if nothing else?
Right. Even take the cynicism. I mean, put cynicism into this. To me, it's inexplicable, Richard, why he wouldn't say. I mean, look at all his fights with de Blasio. What would we always say? Even if he's the last one to the party, he's going to make sure that he's the one wearing the crown at the end. To this one, he's got a chance to flip the script on this. Well, we all know he shut down Moreland, but he could be looked at as a great reformer and get some stuff through.
That's not it. When last time I was on the show, I said that the governor will say that this is an end of an era of corruption and we have to move forward, right?
He didn't even go that far.
No, but you said, oh no, you're going to pass more reforms. No, that's not plain politics, because remember, he had put in the Moreland Commission to control the legislators so that he can, big favors. Well, I'll investigate you if you, don't help me pass my budget or whatever it is. Now, I'm paraphrasing it, of course, but it's leverage when he had the Moreland Commission and he had the legislators basically say, oh, I don't want you, in my backyard. At this point in time, any more reform is not going to help the governor and his political process.
I buy that, but here's where maybe a little naivete creeps in. 2/3 of the lawmakers, especially those that have come in the freshman class and the class before that, they don't have outside jobs. These guys don't want to be tarred with the same basic stigma that's attached to so many in Albany. And they're like, wait a minute, I'm not an attorney on the side where on day 5 when I'm not working in Albany, I go in there, I'm not doing any legal work, I'm just basically using my office here as access. They're like, that's not me. So why am I getting blamed for the rest? I think there's an appetite from some lawmakers to say, forget this, who the heck wants to come home every night and all the neighbors think you're just an unconvicted crook, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, if you're going to go to a full-time legislator, then you're going to have to close the LLC loophole, which allows multiple LLCs of the same.
And you know what? And unions got to give on the Democratic side, and then businesses got to close on the Republican side.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of reform that could take place, but again, I think what the governor is looking at is, I don't want to open up a Pandora's box again.
But he's made mistakes in statements he's made from the very beginning of this. This is an investigatory operation, the Moreland Commission. Then it's not, of course, when he
right. It's my commission. I can do what I want. That's what he said.
It wasn't. It was just a group advising me. and then we're talking about something where he said, well, I don't think they have the appetite. And then the next statement he said, well, maybe we should look at this. I mean, he's all over the lot on this thing.
Yeah. And you know what? Whether he likes it or not, you broke it, you own it. And to me, this is him, right? And I've praised this governor. I think politically he's as shrewd as the next guy. I don't understand. I've heard some of the same arguments you're saying is this is the card to play here, but I think he's missing the big one. The public's had it. You can't shock them anymore. I mean, that's maybe the worst indictment on Albany is people expect this. I mean, it's shocking to me. The Senate Majority Leader and the Assembly Speaker are both convicted and are going to go away. Shelley Silver, who I thought was, forget your politics, the smartest guy in the room when it came to playing this, he is going away. And to me, that is stunning. And more people are going to fall. Anyone who doesn't think that is not remotely following this. And the folks in Nassau County, I would think that you may be getting some calls from the U.S. Attorney in the not too distant future. That all said, there is this thing called a constitutional convention, and next year we could have this. Do you think, from a practical standpoint, that might be the opening where it's not a governor or a party or even a body, that this is something, basically a charter that could change here that will let people save face, if you will?
Well, in theory it could be. But what's happened in other conventions, as history will tell you, is you get the same people who are in the legislature, the same people who have something to hide or to protect, who are delegates at the convention, and therefore you do not get the kind of enormous. Now, if you change that process, which I suppose could be done, you might have a different outcome. But right now, you're looking at essentially the same players become delegates to the convention, run the convention essentially, and you don't end up with the type of reforms you really need. And it's what's really sad about this is even people in the assembly, for example, are saying there's no reform going on. It's the same thing it was, except that the current leader is trying to be nicer and friendlier with his members.
I've heard from some, Richard, that say, Shelley Mayer, for one, who I think is one of the good ones, right? She said there really is more change. There really is more transparency. Maybe I've been burned so many times, I reserve judgment at best. But to me, the biggest problem, and you saw it even as early as this week, is out of what's the budget, 120 billion?
Yeah, 38
yeah, okay. $2.6 billion is sitting in a lump sum, discretionary, that's at the part of leadership. And what does leadership mean? It means the Speaker of the Assembly and the Senate Majority Leader. They basically decide where it goes.
That's right.
So think about it for a second. If they're sitting on a pot basically of gold here, decide which district's going to get what, which project will get funded, which one won't, who gets the committee ship, who doesn't, what bill gets to even get to the floor to get voted on. What's really changed?
That's exactly right. Now remember, what used to happen is that members and the legislature used to get member items they could count on. Now that's all been pulled back, and the leaders decide who gets to bring pork back to their districts. The leadership is always going to figure out how they can control the members and stay power. What's the saying? Absolute power. I mean, power corrupts absolutely. So that's what happens here. There's that people coalesce power. And in order to keep your ducks or your fellow legislators in line, you have to dole out some,
well,
some
the
good.
Interesting thing about this is for all those people who argue that this is all related to campaign finance reform, it isn't.
No.
It's related to structural changes that need to take place in Albany. It's not just related to how people get there.
All right, I'm going to give you like a Chinese menu to pick off of things that would make a material difference if you could get some reform through, and they're not in any order of priority. Taking pensions away from anyone who's convicted, not just them, but also families. Term limits. Campaign finance reform in whatever iteration you'd believe. Removing outside income altogether and making this a full-time job. I'm sure I'm leaving out a few, but those are the big five that I keep hearing a lot. Which ones do you think would have the most systemic change if they got implemented?
I think you missed what Richard's talking about and you're talking about.
Yeah,
you got to change how you divvy out money, make it, let everybody know how the money is being taken out, and that's really a key issue here. Then you got the LLC reform. You need to do that in terms of the campaign finance.
And I think Democrats, to be fair, would have to have some this wouldn't apply just to LLCs, but also to union funding in terms of big checks here. So there could be give on both sides. But
without going to public finance, and you can do that and actually make a difference. I think the idea of capping salaries of outside income so that you know exactly where it's coming from is important. I think term limits are not the answer. I think people should have the right to vote whoever they want to.
A guy who's elected 5 times. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I started out liking term limits and decided against it for some reason. But I don't think ultimately it's the best way. But a lot of those issues can be done, and they're not enormous. I mean, some of these things can be done literally administratively by these houses of our elected officials.
And how about the pension question? I had this debate last night with our friend Richard Brodsky and others at the table. I know it won't change the way Albany works, but you know what? Not everybody gets a pension. In today's world. And I understand the idea that there should be a bit of compassion, because if you look at Shelley Silver, he did a lot of good over his years, in addition to obviously what he's going to be punished for. And what about his family after he passes away? But you know what? There was a public trust. You weren't making widgets. You took an oath, in his case, every 2 years, that you were going to uphold basically the trust of the public here, that you were going to do the bidding of the work of the public, not to enrich yourself by abusing your power. I'm sorry. You should lose your pension, at least in my vote here. And maybe it's a small thing. It's not going to really change a lot. But I think symbols to the public are important, too. I think that's one where they could start.
Yeah, look, I'm not for the season of the pension. I think if you go when you go through a federal process, and I've been through one representing a client, you're going to get fined by the federal government.
Right?
No, well, he went through one, but he was a different client. I represented him on something different, not the federal case, though, in the state case with Andrew Cuomo. But look, the federal government's going to fine you for whatever they see fit, and that's where you have to pay that fine, and that part of that fine could be whatever you stole from the public, and so that is punishment.
By the way, will Silver lose? I've heard he's going to have to get back the $4 to $5 million.
If he's fined, yes. A fine typically always comes with the conviction. So yeah, it's more likely he's going to be not only serve jail time, but be fined. But of course, he's going to appeal.
I got to wrap this. But finally, are you guys optimistic that there's a better day coming to Albany after all this, or do you think that we're just going to rearrange the deck chairs and 5 years from now we'll be having the same conversation with different players?
That's a really good question. I think things have to change because a lot of this is this unspoken manner in which we govern, okay? And so it may not be the quid pro quo that we all thought what it should be, which is a signed agreement saying, you give me this and I promise to give you government money. I mean, it wasn't those.
No envelopes changing hands in the dead of night.
It wasn't that. But it was close enough in all the circumstantial evidence that you can't operate that way. Being a big shot as an elected official trying to get deals and special deals for people. And
so you're optimistic or you're not?
I go for the optimism. I think things will...
Half full, half empty.
Half empty. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Again, you've got to be more transparent in the legislature. You've got to have power sharing, which means that people can bring their bills outside of committee. They can bring them to the floor.
Well, if you
can't
want to
coalesce
sharing,
all in two people.
If you want to talk about sharing, Richard, I got a guy who doesn't like to do too much of that. I'm talking about the Donald. And he's not ducking away from his Muslim ban. That as Trump doubles down, his numbers are only going up here. I got two Republicans at the table. I'm going to ask, what does that tell you about today's GOP?